Thank you, Janice. I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have an expert with us today, and I want to be able to use every bit of her time. Thank you. So today I'm delighted to introduce you to Anna Mills. She teaches writing at Cañada College and previously taught at City College of San Francisco, and she lives in San Francisco. Her collection, AI Text Generators and Teaching Writing, Starting Points for Inquiry, is featured in the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse. She serves on the MLA/CCCC Task Force on Writing and AI. She's a consultant for OpenAI, and she tested ChatGPT 4 before its release. She's also written about open education resource textbook. She's written an open education textbook, and she has AI and writing articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed. So I'm delighted to have her with us today. We are doing this online because she could only join us online today. So we're going to ask that we hold all questions till the end. I know that's something we don't often do in CAT, but because we have her here, we're going to ask to hold all questions to the end. If you've got really cool questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, but we will just then ask her at the end so she can get through all of her important material today. All right. So with that, Anna, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. And I wish I could be there in person. But, you know, I think there are advantages to this as well. So just to give you a little heads up on what to expect, I want to sort of cover a lot of bases and offer kind of some framing and some practical guidance that would be useful, starting out basic background on AI and the future of work. Some ways to introduce AI literacy in the classroom that are very simple and quick. And then, you know, more of a deep dive into ways we can guide students around appropriate AI use and principles for integrating AI into pedagogy, as well as sort of two big approaches to that. And we'll try one of them out together. So it's a lot to get through, and I am excited for your questions and the discussion. So please do put things in the chat as we go. And I did put the link to the slides, so you'll have all the links, and you can also comment on the slides if you like. So I like to start out by sort of questioning, what do we really mean by AI? And just acknowledge that we hear a lot of hype about AI, and that it's sort of associated with something almost magical or miraculous. But to ground us, that term is mostly used these days to refer to these computer systems that basically are uncovering patterns in big data and are following those patterns to make some predictions or recommendations. They're using what's known as machine learning. So it's kind of a statistical engine. And when we say AI in higher ed, we're often talking, especially pedagogically, about generative AI systems that can output text, images, and video. I'm sure you're familiar with ChatGPT as an example of an AI text generator or large language model. To me, you know, it's always helpful to remind myself of that core concept that it's predicting next words, and it's predicting responses based on human text that it's analyzed. So it's kind of answering this question of what would the humans write next? How would a human writer continue on from whatever question or prompt we give it? So it's copying patterns at some deep level and predicting next words, but not usually copying verbatim. So again, is it really intelligence? That's a huge question for philosophical debate. But let's think of it as a prediction engine. And I think it's also nice to highlight, even though we do have focused on ChatGPT so much, that we actually have quite a few options for systems in the same class that are close in quality, So I just want to put those out there. So we know what we're talking about. It's not just this one product from OpenAI. It's also Claude from Anthropic, the open source Meta's Llama, Google's Bard, and Google is releasing a more advanced version soon, Microsoft's Bing. And if you haven't tried Poe.com, that's a really interesting platform because you can compare different underlying systems and you can also make your own bot. And all of these you can use for free, though there may be a premium version. So I want to sort of frame how we respond as educators, starting out with this question of what does our students' future with AI look like? What are we preparing them for? And because when I'm thinking about how do I want to guide my students, I'm thinking, what is it they'll have to do in future? And I turn to this report from the McKinsey Global Institute. There's a recent IMF report that echoes pretty much the same themes. But they were looking at the future of work and AI. And we know we hear this concern that AI will take jobs, right? Is that true? Is that not true? We don't know exactly to what extent, right? But what we do know, and what this report found, was that they see generative AI enhancing the way that STEM, creative, and business and legal professionals work, rather than eliminating a lot of jobs outright. So what does that mean, enhancing? It means that it will change the way that we work and that we will work with AI. And they see that as underscoring the importance of flexibility and upskilling, reskilling, and training. The IMF also emphasized the importance of higher education in preparing people to work with AI and to have sort of flexibility as the structure of work changes. So what does that look like? What might students be facing in their professional careers with AI? Well, I think it's helpful to note that, the future is not necessarily an app like ChatGPT. Increasingly, we're seeing these systems integrated into everywhere that we write. So specifically, I'm talking about writing because that's my focus, but so integrated into digital writing environments and something that they could use in a lot of different ways throughout a task. So you can sign up for Google's beta text generation within Google Docs and get a glimpse of this. And basically it just looks like Google Docs, except that there's this little pencil with the almost magic fairy dust kind of logo, which is a little bit of hype, right? But, and there's that sort of very tempting slogan, help me write, right? And anyone who struggled with writing, which I certainly do, that's such a siren call, right? Help me write. And it's there all the time, and it will generate text that you then can insert into your document. And it's not just about generating the text, it's about selecting the text and then getting AI to suggest ways to change it. So changing the tone, summarizing, elaborating, shortening, or you can give it your own custom request for revision, right? So we're seeing this way in which it's very enmeshed, and it might be difficult to separate what's the AI and what's the human. So that leads to this question of what skills do you need to work with that kind of integrated use of AI? And just at a really basic level, I think you don't need coding, right? This is a natural language system. You ask it for what you want. And then in order to sort of add value, you've got to be able to question what it gives you and modify it. So you're rejecting, you're adding, you're starting over, you're changing the directions, you're articulating more of what you want. And what do you need to be able to do that? I think the good news is that a lot of what you need is what we already teach, right? So critical thinking, reading and writing skills, and subject matter expertise. But you also need some knowledge of what kinds of weaknesses to look out for in AI, some understanding of what these systems are and what they're not. So I'm going to call that a critical AI literacy. And that's a big umbrella. It can include a lot of things that that we need to keep in mind as we work with these systems. So including things like what will happen with my data when I give it to this system, privacy and data rights. Things like the fact that AI will make things up, that it doesn't necessarily have a way to check the truth or accuracy of what it's putting out there. And that can be called fabrication or hallucination. Things like the bias that's inherent in many of these systems because they've been trained on sets of data that reflect a lot of bias. So even though they might seem like they would be more neutral, they actually can be more biased than a human. And just a basic lack of real understanding or consciousness behind what's coming out of the system. So knowing that it's predicting, right? It's predicting text. So I want to offer kind of as a practical offering, I know as a teacher, I don't want AI to take over every class I teach. I don't want that to be the only thing I teach. And there are so many things and priorities, right? So I wanted to offer some sort of ways to get started on this, very short AI micro lessons that can help us start to build this kind of foundation with students, and even before we might use AI in pedagogy. So I'm just, there are a million ways to do this, but just to share a few that I think are very impactful in just a few minutes in class. So this little TikTok video of 3 minutes, I think has been, it's fairly accurate, and it's a very clear, direct message that ChatGPT doesn't know anything, right? That it's a predictive machine. And this is a really wonderful video actually from a couple of years ago that still provides a kind of entertaining, engaging introduction to how computers generate text and what kinds of pitfalls happen with that and what the implications might be. So this is a kind of a favorite New York Times article that's interactive that I also have shared with students. And the way it works is you can pick which genre you want because they've trained some little baby AI language models to generate in the style of Harry Potter or Star Trek or Shakespeare or Moby Dick or Jane Austen. And so you can see how when they start training the system, it just produces gobbledygook. But as they keep training it on text, it starts to produce things that look more like the style that we'd be expecting, but they still don't make sense. And I think that's the key is for students really to get a sense of that, oh, that's recognizable as the style of Harry Potter, but it's pretty meaningless. So here, just as a sample, if you give it a prompt about Hermione and Professor Dumbledore and Harry, it spits out these sentences that reference things from Harry Potter, but there's not a clear sequence of actions or plot. It just sounds like the flavor of the text. He looked back at the room, but they didn't seem pretend to blame Umbridge in the ministry. Doesn't make sense, but those elements do fit Harry Potter. So just to give students a brief picture of that collision between the style is plausible, but the meaning is absent. And this is a way to do a very brief micro lesson on privacy. I know privacy is something I always think I should pay more attention to than I do. And so just the idea of let's take 2 or 3 minutes to bring up the privacy policy for one of these systems. Before we use it in class or before we talk about a ChatGPT transcript, let's actually just look at the link for the OpenAI privacy policy. How can they use our data? When we type something into it, how are they going to use that? And this is inspired by a wonderful blog post by Autumn Keynes that's a more extensive assignment on annotating these privacy policies. And I think when we do that, we see that it's actually a pretty broad license if you're using ChatGPT directly, that they can use your data to improve their services and conduct research. So that underscores the need to not give it sensitive information, or to consider another way to interact with these systems that would be more protected. Now, one of my favorite things to teach about is this idea that these systems will make things up. That's usually called hallucination. But many have commented that that's kind of a misnomer because it implies that the systems are actually dreaming or experiencing something. So we could call it fabrication or data mirages or auto-synthesized misinformation. Basically, it's spitting things out that are not true and not real. And just to show students that, right? So sharing a chat session where something is made up, and then showing them the credible source that proves that. So here's an example of that you can borrow. I asked it for a set of surprising facts about AI, and I asked it to provide sources and explain why they were credible for these surprising facts. And it came up with a bunch of statements which were not too surprisingly on the side of promoting AI. And most of them had some real sources, but some of them had made up sources. And this one had a source that sounded very authoritative, academic. I couldn't tell by looking at it that it was made up, but when I searched on it, it did not exist. There was no such paper and no such author. It cited Jan Bengio and said that he was a Turing Award winner. However, this was pretty humorous and memorable for students because when you look it up, there is a Jan LeCun and there is a Joshua Bengio, and they are computer scientists considered godfathers of AI. They have collaborated, but ChatGPT just merged their names, right? And does that with complete confidence, right? And plausibility. So we've got to check, right? It's nonsense under the surface. I think that to show AI bias, even if we want to show, get in the idea that the text coming out of these systems may well be biased, especially against marginalized groups or underrepresented groups. Sometimes it can be most compelling to do that visually. There are a couple of great short videos that I have used, one by Sophia Umoja Noble of USC, based on her book, Algorithms of Oppression, which I have also taught from. She goes into Google search and how it produces biased search predictions. And she gives a wonderful brief talk about that. And that's the same kind of mechanism we're talking about with ChatGPT. It's word prediction, right? Based on a biased data set. And another wonderful video is from Joy Buolamwini of MIT called Gender Shades. And I just want to show you a tiny peek at that. I'm not going to show the video, but I just wanted to show the still because she is so dynamic and charismatic. And she really merges a conversational tone with showing the structure of her research and the publications that have come out of it. But she shows that facial recognition software is racially biased in an intersectional way. And she does that very memorably by putting on a white mask and showing that the software recognizes her face in that case. So beyond those videos, there is a really wonderful article that also has great visuals, how AI reduces the world to stereotypes. And this was from restoftheworld.org, and they prompted the AI image generator Midjourney, and they found that, you know, when you asked for a Mexican person, you got dozens of images very similar to this one in the center of a man with a sombrero in more traditional dress. And they did a whole bunch of experiments in different with different kinds of prompts. And this could be a great springboard for students to experiment and to discuss, and just to have that image that implants on the brain of, this is the kind of data that these systems are working with, and they're going to replicate it. These kinds of stereotypes and misconceptions. Another fun one is to look fun and disturbing, but fun because it's referencing Barbie, but disturbing in what it shows. So BuzzFeed did some experiments over the summer, and Business Insider reported on it. If you ask for Barbies from different countries in the world, you get these very biased and inaccurate portrayals of national identity. So when they asked for a South Sudan Barbie, it showed a woman with a gun. When they asked for a Thailand Barbie, they got sort of a blonde Russian style appearance. And some of the Middle Eastern Barbies were wearing what's actually a traditional headdress for men. So these kind of very embarrassing kind of gaffes and stereotypes that are very essentializing of these cultures. So, you know, clearly that could be extended. Students could experiment with it, learn more, you know, do things in relation to their own identities, or it could be a 5-minute, like, just remember, this is what these systems do, right? And similarly, when we want to show how the text can be misguided, and we want to show that lack of basic understanding that AI has, that so comically sort of appears sometimes, we can do that very simply and directly. So, you know, I think it's easy to be impressed, and I often am, by how slick and articulate some of the outputs are, especially from the more advanced GPT-4 system. That's the sort of premium ChatGPT. And it's so easy to lend too much credibility to that, and especially for our students, but also for me, I find there's this moment of superficial, wow, that sounds really articulate and plausible, and that sounds right. I think it got it right, right? And then you have to dig deeper. And I think seeing these examples where it's just completely wrong and it's confident can really help to embed that understanding that sounds like it knows what it's talking about, and no. So here's a sample where I asked it, how many N's are in the word counter, right? And it responds that the word counter has 2 N's in it. So as simple as that, like it cannot count letters, right? And there's a lot of discussion of why this is, and maybe at some point they'll solve that particular issue, but there will still be examples of things that it doesn't get, right? That it doesn't understand in the way that we do. Here's another example where it does math wrong. So it got the answer right at first when I asked it to give the decimal equivalent of 1/3. But when I told it was wrong, it agreed with me. It said, you are right. It's 33.34%. You know, stroked my ego, apologized, and was completely wrong, right? So I think that, you know, we want to put it in its place a little and have these stark reminders that it's not thinking. And we could develop microlessons around a host of other major and complex considerations around AI. I love this resource, Teaching AI Ethics by Leon Furs. Things like copyright and intellectual property, colonialism, and human labor that goes into supporting these systems, environmental impacts. So we certainly could develop more microlessons. But I start with those because I think they're kind of the foundation for being skeptical of these systems. So beyond sort of just introducing students to a little bit of a basic critical perspective, I do think that it's important to think about how do we want to guide students around the place of AI in learning, in their own learning process. And I know there's a lot of discussion of embracing versus banning AI. I tend to not want to sort of be in either extreme camp, and to see the connections between them, that there are ways that using it could interfere with learning in certain situations. And so students do need guidance. And the forms that takes that I want to kind of outline are explicit policies around it, best practices in assigning writing to prevent sort of misuse, and some approaches to accountability. So I really love this blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for Education that Catherine Conrad wrote. And I quote from it all the time. And she just says simply that students should be able to expect clear guidance from your instructor on which specific systems are appropriate for which assignment, if any, right? And the task force that I'm on has really called for instructors to make policy explicit, and to promote an ethic of transparency around the use of AI tech. So that's kind of a foundation for academic work, that we want to build on our teaching about source citation to encourage students to be transparent about any use of AI. And beyond that, recognize that these policies may need to change, that we may need to have continuing discussion of them, and that policy can happen at multiple levels. So from the institution to the classroom to the assignment specific policy. And I offer a few resources here. I think the biggest one is this set of sample policies that Lance Eaton has collected. But to highlight a couple that I think I've drawn on, this one from Rutgers offers language for 3 different policy options that you can borrow, depending on how sort of cautionary, how much you want to limit the use. And here's an example of one that's very cautionary from Whitney Gegg Harrison, and one that's more pro AI from Joel Glad. And that one can be used as a template as well. I know you already have some policies in place, and so I'm not going to go more in detail about that, but I do think it's sort of a first step, and that we can revisit it. And then that we can discuss it with students, and acknowledge the ongoing nature of the discussion about what is the place of AI. I really love this recent video from Joss Fong for Vox.com. It's quite provocative. There's a lot of little bits of interview from teachers and students about how they have used AI, and how they've gotten around sort of policies, and how different teachers have responded in such varying ways. So you really get a sense of like, this is a rich controversy, and it's very engaging video. So I think it's great to discuss with students. But so beyond policy, I think a piece of good news, I think, for guiding students around AI and preventing kind of the cheating, the auto-generating of papers that was sort of the first wave of reaction of fear around these systems. The message is that what we already know about best practices in assigning writing, those best practices are probably the most effective way at preventing this kind of misuse. So purposeful, meaningful, supported writing instruction can go a really long way to reducing that chance. And that means coming back to this question of why do we assign writing in college? And really sharing with students the sense of we're assigning writing to foster thinking, that what matters is not the product, but the thinking process that comes with writing. And I love the way that this Association for Writing Across the Curriculum has articulated that in a statement they made on AI, affirming that writing is a mode of learning, that students develop understanding and insights through the act of writing. And that's something that we can continue to affirm. And so if we're designing writing assessments that emphasize purpose and engagement, the students' development of their own voice, their discovery of what it is that they think or want to say, if we're creating assignments that have intrinsic meaning, an audience, that allow some room for creativity and choice, that's going to be motivating, right? Students are going to be less likely to want to auto-generate that essay. And the other kind of big message from the Writing Across the Curriculum movement, I think, and from research into writing pedagogy, is that learning writing happens in relationship, that the meaning of writing comes in relation to a human audience, both the teacher and the peers, and that we can build writing assignments around relationship. We can include conferences with students that even might look like video or audio feedback, and we can invite peer responses and peer review. And the other big message around writing instruction is that it's valuable to teach the writing process and to support the writing process. So even if we're not, and I know this is very difficult and it's a question of labor and time when you're teaching a course that's not writing focused, but you want to teach with writing. But I think there can be some ways to do this without, spending a whole class period on peer review. There are ways to assign collaborative annotation of texts, pre-writing, brainstorming, to sort of give credit for participation without giving extensive feedback on every step. But to support that process and acknowledge it is setting the students up to do their own work and not to be looking at that choice to auto-generate at the last minute. So let's see, let me go back to that, because that does include supporting reflections on the thinking and writing process. So sort of this metacognitive aspect where they're thinking about, what did I get out of the writing? Where did I struggle? What strategies did I use? And how would I want to improve this further? Is another part of the writing process we can incorporate. So I think those are the most powerful strategies, and I have focused on them in my own pedagogy and prioritized those. And that said, I also acknowledge that I don't think that's enough to prevent all possible AI misuse. It is much easier to use AI than other forms of cheating, I would say. And I also think we need some practices that support accountability beyond good pedagogy. And I'm sure you're aware that this brings up a lot of thorny questions. How can we discourage AI misuse? Can we create assignments AI can't do? Can we detect AI text? Can we trust our intuition to tell what's AI and what's not? Should we be finding ways to observe students as they write, right? So we've heard a lot of discussion about these possibilities and continue to hear it. So I just want to give a few sort of quick responses to those. I think that this idea that we can make assignments that it doesn't do well on has been discredited, but I do still see it around quite a bit. So I just want to affirm that, when you work with these systems, they can sort of simulate pretty much any assignment. So even if we ask for a personal essay or a piece about something that's hyper local or timely, or if we ask for students to reflect on their writing process, the bot can simulate that, right? And especially if the person feeds it whatever bit of information that it needs to go on. So we really can't count on sort of out prompting it. And I certainly use my intuition and value my intuition and my knowledge of the student, my relationship with the student, my knowledge of their other writing, their speaking. That's important. And I want to be wary of it because I know that I have unconscious biases. And possibly it's easy to be overconfident because we spot AI text once and think it's obvious. It doesn't mean it's obvious the other times, unfortunately. So sometimes I do this little quiz, and I'm not going to quiz you because I decided this is kind of like a setup, but where I've given faculty 2 paragraphs and asked them to say which one is AI. It's been pretty consistent that people, tend toward the wrong answer. So this paragraph is AI generated, but Turnitin said it was not AI. And previous workshop participants thought that this was the one that was real student writing. And probably because if you don't tell ChatGPT a lot, it will maybe tend toward a pretty formal academic style. But if you just tell it to be informal or to write in a simple style, it will produce something that I cannot distinguish from student writing. So this here, Robin Marantz Hennig wrote an article in National Geographic about kids and their feelings about gender. She looks at 2 viewpoints, one from a scientist named Eric Villan, one from a mom named Marlo Mack. I won't read the whole thing, but I think it's just, it's not something I could distinguish from student writing. So if we can't rely on our intuition and we can't out prompt it, certainly this is a question about, is there a place for software that detects it automatically? And I'm sure you're familiar, as I've seen some of the literature on your university site about Turnitin's detection. I know my college has Turnitin, and however, even Turnitin acknowledges that its detectors are not fully reliable and shouldn't be used to punish students. And OpenAI as a company actually got rid of its own detection system and basically announced that detectors do not work reliably. And so that was back in September. And we've had research since then that confirms that this article for the International Journal for Educational Integrity found that they tested Turnitin and several other systems like GPT-0 and found that they were not accurate. There was a lot they didn't catch, and they did produce some false positives, which could lead to false accusations. And also, they were just very easy to evade by running the AI text through paraphrase software like Quillbot. There are also a whole bunch of websites that are just dedicated to quote unquote humanizing AI writing, something that I would love to see regulated. But so it's pretty trivial for students to get around AI text detection. So I would also note, I should have a slide about this, but that there's also a study out of Stanford showing that these systems, the text detection is biased against English language learners. So, these systems have not been tested for bias, essentially. Okay, so if we're not going to rely on detection, I'm going to leave it agnostic as to whether there might be a place for detection in some form. But certainly it's not a fix for the question of accountability. Another alternative approach that I have been using is to ask students to share their version history on a writing assignment. And this is something I saw advocated by Dave Sayers in Times Higher Ed, just using Google Docs version history, noting that if students are doing their own writing, you will see some evidence of revision and correction of typos and moving things around. And so seeing that history can help us to get a sense of the writing process and can make it more difficult just to copy and paste a ChatGPT essay, right? And there are a number of apps that I've been experimenting with that sort of facilitate this. So if you assign writing, you can use these apps to sort of look back at the student process. Now, this is a big question about, is this surveillance? Is this invasive of the student writing process? Or is this really another form of observation akin to assigning steps in the writing process, like asking them to turn in their brainstorm, right? And I think that's an important discussion for us to have. I have decided that I would offer students, if they preferred not to have this, they could tell me about an alternate process they want to use. If they're using apps like, say, for voice typing or accessibility, they might have an alternate writing process and they don't want to do all their typing in one Google Doc. But I am using this system as sort of a default. And the way that I do it, I don't find it to involve additional labor because I'm using an app that kind of gives me a summary of how much time has been spent in a document, how many big copy pastes, how many deletions. And I'm only looking into the details if there's a concern. If it says they only spent 15 minutes on the 10-page essay, then I'm going to look at some more details about their writing process. But most of the time, I'm not. So if I do want to see the details, I can see which segments were copied and pasted. Of course, I have to recognize that there are legitimate reasons to copy and paste. But it's a beginning of kind of a process of inquiry where I might discuss with the student what their process was and find out more about the essay. And I can even replay the drafting process as a kind of little video of the typing in the document. Ideally, this would become a part of a way that we ask students to reflect on their writing process. Oh, I'm sorry. And it's not foolproof. So as Lance Eaton observes, they could just retype the AI text and insert revisions and deletions. They could even ask the AI to suggest how to revise it, right? So, but that would be pretty clunky and cumbersome for the student. And just the fact that they would have to do that is going to deter a lot of possible misuse. Clearly, another option that we have is in-class writing and oral assessments. And I think these certainly could have a place in encouraging accountability and helping us get to know a baseline of a student's writing style. Overall, I guess my message is that we need some flexibility and to combine various approaches to supporting the writing process and to accountability. My goal in kind of finding that balance and choosing a combination of these approaches is not to punish, but to reduce the likelihood that students are going to misuse AI, and to increase the likelihood that they are going to engage with the writing process and in order to learn, right? So that's the bottom line. And I'm sorry, I don't have a formula, but I think the good news is that that leaves a lot to our expertise and our pedagogical explorations as teachers, finding that balance of approaches to still assigning writing and having some accountability, reducing the chance of misuse. Okay. So that said, I want to look at some ways that we might use AI in pedagogy. And I think that, my big message is that we can bring together the critical AI literacy with some benefits for our existing learning outcomes. So we want to look for ways to incorporate AI that help build skepticism of these AI outputs, that give students practice critiquing them. And certainly we want to stimulate thinking and learning rather than replacing it. But specifically, we're saying, how can this support our existing learning goals? And how can it help students build confidence and awareness of their own process of thinking? And that means sometimes I do self-correct because I find, this amazing new AI tool that I want to think about, but sometimes I realize that's going to distract students from something that's actually more important in the learning outcome. So focusing on how is it going to help build their confidence is important to me. And one fundamental approach that you may have probably heard of is the idea that we want them to critique AI performance on something in our discipline, right? Something that we want to teach in the discipline. So either we give them the AI output or we invite them to generate it, but either way, they're reflecting on how well did the AI do. They might be annotating it or they might be writing a piece about it. But I think it's important to encourage students just to be confident in critiquing. And I do that by giving them a set of template phrases for critiquing AI that really emphasize this idea that it's going to sound plausible, but maybe it doesn't really make sense. Or here's why it's inaccurate. Here's how it misinterprets this concept, right? And you can use that set of phrases. I've linked to it. So again, in the interest of easy ways to start, Perplexity AI is an AI system that doesn't require login, and it does search the internet, and it also does just generate text. So one thing we can do is have students search for something in our discipline and have them check whether this system is actually summarizing it right. Is it summarizing this article correctly? Or is it distorting the whole concept or emphasizing the wrong thing, right? And sometimes it will. So I know we're a bit low on time, but I thought we could actually try this together with Perplexity in our disciplines. So not just summarizing an article, but the idea of coming up with an example related to a core concept that we want to teach. I think one advantage of these systems for text generation is that they're so responsive to very specific requests. So a search engine is not going to give us necessarily 3 examples of a circular reasoning fallacy that emphasize the theme of nonviolence. Or, if we want something very specific, then we can get that from a text generator and then critique it. So that can be fun because we can ask students to pick a theme or a topic for us to generate an example of a concept. So I thought it would be neat to try that very briefly. If you haven't tried Perplexity AI, I'm going to put it in the chat. And you can just go there and very quickly put in a concept that you teach. Ask it for an example of a concept that you teach. And then see, does it get it basically right? and I know we're short on time, but I really wanted to have people actually get to do something yourselves. So while you're doing that, I will demonstrate it as well. See. So here's perplexity. One thing to know in perplexity is you can go to this little focus button and you can just select writing, and then you have something very similar to ChatGPT without logging in. So you're not asking students to create an account and feed personal data. So let's see. Give me an example of the law. Let's see, of operant conditioning. Anybody have an example you want to throw out? As you're trying this, if you want to put your results in the chat, feel free. Yeah, Carmen.
So hi, yes, I'm teaching a class on Afro-Latin American studies, and one of the terminologies or the concepts that the students are learning is this Afro-Latinidad, right? So I went into it. I just literally did what you said, wrote the concept, and it gave me let's see, about 4 paragraphs that define the concept. And it's at first glance looks really accurate. But I have to, I have to have the time to look into it and see if it is really accurate. But it seems very much. Do you want me to read it?
No, that's okay. I mean, I would love to, but I think we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure we get some other questions in. But that's good to know that it gave so much. And I wonder if we could ask it to make up a story that illustrates Afro-Latinidad. If we pushed it to get more specific, we might get something that was more interesting for discussion or argument or easier to critique. That's interesting that Elizabeth is saying that it didn't follow directions. Yeah, so we could really play with this and experiment more. But I think just that point that, we're getting something plausible, but how good is it really under the surface? And I think the dynamism of exploring that with students in our subject matter, there's a lot of potential there. Some people even argue that you want to use a system that's not as good so that they kind of see the bare bones of how these systems are not thinking, and get some practice seeing where it's wrong. That's arguable. Do you want to use the state of the art or something more clunky?
I just want to say that I did what you told me, and it is so funny because it's not accurate at all. It just went like once upon a time in Latin America.
Okay. So that shows where it doesn't get it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I know folks are saying you've got to leave to class, so I just want to thank you for coming. And the slides are available, and I'm happy to be in touch. I'll just show my last slide so that folks headed out. If you want to reach out to me with follow-up questions, you're more than welcome to. And the recording will be available, I believe, as well after. But the other approach that I did want to briefly highlight was, before we run out of time, is the idea that it can also be used, besides the idea of critiquing AI in our subject areas, we can also use AI for writing feedback. So this is controversial, and it's something that I do believe can be done, but there are some pitfalls. So I do think, as I emphasize the human nature of the writing process, peer and instructor feedback, having a human audience is important. But could there be supplementary writing feedback that could help students and that could fill in needs that are not usually met? And could that be used to also teach critical AI literacy? So if we encourage students to ask for specific writing feedback, they're stuck, it's late at night, ask it for, what's a counter argument I should address? And then critique what it gives them, right? So question the feedback it's giving them, and maybe check in with a teacher about it. So I make a case here for sort of guidance and guardrails around AI writing feedback. And I have advised on this app as a volunteer advisor, sort of created by teachers. But the idea is we wanted to create something where teachers supervise that AI feedback, and give students credit for reflecting on it, and give teachers and students some choice about what kind of feedback and some control. So I'll just leave that there. If you want to explore myessayfeedback.ai, it is free to pilot this semester still, and it's based on GPT-4. So it does give some pretty good suggestions that are specific, that will quote from the student essay. And there's a whole library of feedback prompts that you can draw from that are written by teachers. And then just to note that if we are using AI in pedagogy, we want to think about what if the students don't want to use it, if they're not comfortable with the data use or the privacy concerns. At this point, I am giving students an alternative to allow for that. And that is a recommendation also of that blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for Education that I mentioned. And there are a lot of wonderful collections of ideas for AI pedagogy that I highlight in the slides here that you could explore further. I won't say more about that, but you're also more than welcome to submit your own teaching reflections to this, this last one, Exploring AI Pedagogy. I think that the key takeaway I would want to leave you with is just that we shouldn't be intimidated by this, and we shouldn't wait until we have the bandwidth. There are ways to get started, and our voices and expertise are needed here. The students need our guidance, and also we have the skills, the communication skills that are needed to work with these systems, and also to critique them and think about AI policy and regulation. So I hope that it shouldn't feel like another huge imposed burden. There are ways that it can be doable and accessible and also enjoyable. I do find it kind of fun and interesting. There's space for play and curiosity here. And I hope that you would have some of that sense of enjoyment in exploring it, as well as a sense of, oh, another thing, right? So our expertise and our enjoyment can come into this as we try to guide students. And that's my message. I'm going to check the chat, and I'm not in a rush to leave, so I'm happy to answer questions, or you can follow up with me. I'll put my email in the chat as well.
Thanks, Hannah, so much. Everybody, if y'all will just join me in clapping on Zoom, either with your clap reaction or with your video. Thank you so much for doing this. As Anna said, she does have a few minutes to kind of hang out if you want to ask questions. If you need to run, if you want to put your question in the chat, we can capture those and ask them for you, or you've got her email and you can ask her yourself. But we are doing a whole series of AI talks this semester. Keep a lookout for what's going on in CAT. And thank you so much for coming. Please do the evaluation too on the way out. Anna, thank you so much. If you've got a question that you would like to ask, just maybe unmute yourself and ask the question. Or like I said, if you want us to ask it, you can put it in the chat.